button here, and it's on. Well, thank you all for coming. I know that we've got a mixture here of people who are here for the workshop, but I also know that we have people who are not part of the workshop, and I really want to try to talk to both sets of people. Can I just get a show of hands of those of you who are just sound studies is something you might be curious about rather than knowing something about? Excellent. So what I planned is a brief chronological survey of where sound studies started and its evolution through time. And then I'm going to devote some time at the end to thinking about recent developments in sound studies, and then finish by thinking about particular applications to historical sound studies, which is the subject of the workshop. Okay, and I really do want to thank Mark and Alex for arranging this. It's great to be here because sound studies actually, many people think it had its beginnings at Simon Fraser University in the World Soundscape Project. So it's kind of exciting to be here on the home turf of sound studies. Okay, so let me start by considering the word field, sound studies as a field. So I'm going to be discussing sound studies as a field in three distinct senses of the term. First, the extent of what can be perceived through hearing, a branch of academic study, and a region of space in which force is exerted on objects within that region, as in force field. I'd also like to begin with something quite personal, and that is how I got interested in sound studies to start with and wrote the book, The Acoustic World of Early Modern England, and the answer is boredom. I have spent most of my career, all of my career, as a Shakespeare scholar. And during the 1970s and 1980s, the reigning paradigms of criticism in Shakespeare studies were based on deconstruction and political commitments. And that was really a necessary reaction against the kind of investment in individual experience of poetry, what is good, what moves me, what does this say about the biography of the writer, those kinds of questions. So it was important to kind of objectify all of that, but at the same time, it discounted any emotional, personal response. So I thought about, well, what can I write about that wouldn't be easily objectified? And the answer was sound. And the inspiration for the book really came from having heard about this idea that every sound that has ever been made and ever been spoken still exists somewhere within the world's, the atmosphere of the Earth. So it was only later that I found out that the author of this arresting idea was Charles Babbage, who is sometimes credited with having invented the modern computer in the analytical machine, as he called it, that he planned in the 1830s. In his ninth Bridgewater Treatise of 1837, Babbage conceives the Earth's entire atmosphere as a sound field. The title of chapter 9 is On the Permanent Impression of Our Words and Actions on the Globe We Inhabit. And I'm just going to read the quote. The pulsations of the air, once set in motion by the human voice, cease not to exist with the sounds to which they give rise. The motions they have impressed on the particles of one portion of our atmosphere are communicated to constantly increasing numbers, but the total quantity of motion measured in the same direction receives no addition. Each atom loses as much as it gives, and regains again from other atoms portions of those motions which they in turn give up. The waves of air thus raised perambulate the Earth and ocean's surface, and in less than 20 hours, every atom of the atmosphere takes up the altered movement due to that infinitesimal portion of the primitive motion which has been conveyed to it through countless channels, and which must continue to influence its path through its future existence. Thus considered, what a strange chaos is this wide atmosphere we inhabit. So what might we hear at the edges of the Earth's atmosphere? I mean, really, the common sense answer is we would hear nothing because shortly we would be dead. But assuming that we might be able to hear with some kind of aid and some kind of breathing device, what we might actually hear is white noise combined with the sound of our own pulse. This is going to be the first of several sounds that we're going to listen to. And in response, at the end of the lecture, I'd be grateful for any reactions you have to this. It was in the later 19th century that sound first became an object. And there were two developments that explain that shift from subjective experience to objective fact. The first development was mathematical ways of measuring sound. Hertz, the unit of wave frequency, and decibels, the unit of sound pressure level, turned sound into an entity dissevered from the listener. We may hear frequency as pitch and sound pressure as volume, but late 19th century science and technology turned sound into something that exists quite apart from any particular listener. Even timbre, perceived tone quality, violinness, say, versus brassiness, or my speaking voice versus yours, can be plotted using a Fourier series that calculates the sine waves, or overtones, generated by a dominant Hertz tone. These measurements can be visualized in a spectrogram, an example of which you see here. A spectrogram plots frequencies and intensities on the vertical axis against time on the horizontal axis. And what you see here is a spectrogram of a voice saying 19th century. So we have a little bit of a lead in here, and I'm going to talk over it. The second development that transformed sound into an object was sound recording. Using devices like Edison's sound recording shown here on the right with Edison himself at the controls, it became possible to detach sound from its source. Daniel Feaster has claimed that analog recording is but one version of phonography or sound writing, which also includes the alphabet and musical notation. But the new recording technologies of the late 19th century changed the game from representing sound to reproducing sound. The result was an estrangement effect.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this central dawn. All the clouds have been lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreath, our wounded arms and up for monument, our stern alarm is very beating, our dreadful marches to delightful measure.
Sir Henry Irving in 1888 was asked by some friends to come and speak into an Edison recording machine. And he was totally baffled by the effect. One of the witnesses who was there said it was as if he had lost his voice. And Irving was famous for his declamation, and his main venue in London was the Lyceum Theatre that you saw in the earlier slide where The Lion King is on now. But that estrangement effect, you can really see it in an image like the one that I have on the screen here, which really shows you a cylinder and how a cylinder can be put away and stored so that the sound of Sir Henry Irving's voice, that recording was made in 1890, and it's the earliest surviving recording of a Shakespeare speech. That recording allows us to hear that sound more than a century after Irving's death. But the estrangement that he felt when he made the recording, I think, is similar to the estrangement that we feel when we hear this, especially if we hear it without its being digitally enhanced. It sounds small and it sounds contained. It's an object. Okay, I want to take up what I see to be the chronology of sound studies, and I really want to begin with aesthetics. As a term, sound art was coined by William Hellerman for his Sound Art Foundation in the late 1970s, but Hellerman was naming something that already existed. In recording, I am sitting in a room. Lussier used an electromagnetic tape recorder to capture the sound of his own voice in one particular acoustic space, and then played back the recording as he spoke the speech again, this time recording both his original speech and the repeated speech, and so on many times until his voice dissolves into the ambient sound. So let's have a listen. Unfortunately, the connection of my computer to the projector doesn't allow me to fast forward this. So I'm going to have to stop at a certain point and then just tell you what happens when all of those multiple recordings are layered. But here's how he begins.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room different from the one you are
Can you
in now.
begin to hear the overlay? I'm so sorry that I can't fast forward it, but I can tell you that it only takes a minute or two for the voice to dissolve into the room.
Until the
And what you hear is and the fact that Lucier had a natural stutter gives this a kind of personal dimension also.
is destroyed. What you will hear then are the
Okay. The second development in philosophy, phenomenology, and psychology can be traced to Don Eadie's book, Listening and Voice, A Phenomenology of Sound, from 1974. Eadie began, like all phenomenologists do, with trying to decide how it is he knows what he knows. And so he asked himself, how do I know what I know about the world through hearing? And he then plotted differences between the auditory field of perception and the visual field of perception. In the visual field of perception, we do have a sense immediately of the objects that are around us. You see me, I see you. You're an object, and I'm an object. But the sound of my voice is actually creating a sound field in which you are all immersed. And the shape of sound is not, as vision seems to be, linear, but it's spherical. Sound surrounds us all. So in this diagram, he uses the Z's to show moving objects, and he uses the X's to show fixed objects, and he does allow in this Venn diagram for an overlap. So I'm going to play you a recording of someone walking in Little Italy in Toronto on a warm August evening. And I'd like for you to think about the dynamics of the auditory space. I have to tell you that there is in this a saxophone player that kind of acts as a kind of fixed point, but just listen for all of the movement and think about the movement as something that sound can actually attune us to. Okay, I hope you can hear what I'm talking about, just how much movement is going on in terms of sound. Okay, the next development, and really probably this is the really pivotal one, is the discipline of ecology. So when you listen to that recording of a person's walk on a warm August evening in Little Italy in Toronto, the prominence of the saxophone operates within that environment as what R. Murray Schafer, in his landmark book, The Tuning of the World, which appeared in 1977 and then was revised in 1994, regards as a sound mark. So R. Murray Schafer founded the World Soundscape Project at Simon Fraser University in the late 1960s, and then this book was one of the culminations of that. And the idea is to think about a soundscape, one of the buzzwords from our upcoming workshop, in terms similar to landscape, in the sense that any geographical and culturally defined space has sound marks, like in the case of my university, it's a tall tower with a carillon that is played every day at noon. It happens also to be visually the tallest tower on campus. So it both visually and orally establishes a territory. It also happens at the University of Southern California. It's surrounded by heavily traveled streets. So there is a constant boundary, auditory boundary, that is present in the sound of freeways. And there are also sound signals that in most of our experience would be things like sirens of ambulances and police cars. But there are also, and I think this is the thing that I really want to emphasize here, is the idea that these sounds change in time, and that they establish a background of sound, as it were. So this is a table showing the cycles of natural soundscapes of the west coast of British Columbia by relative volume of sound, so that keynote sounds, another coinage by Schafer, in this case would be various forms of water, in the sense of tides, rivers, ice. That seems to be, according to this mapping, part of, that is the keynote sound that lets us know this place is different from other places. Okay, let's move on from there. So I want to move on then to the next field that I think has contributed to the development of sound studies, and that is cinema. So in 1980, there was a special issue of Yale French Studies, which at the time was a major venue for theory with a capital T, and it was devoted to cinema sound, cinema/sound. The editor, Rick Altman, sets the agenda in his introduction to rescue sound from its status as a taken-for-granted technology and to make it an object of analysis and appreciation in its own right. One of the articles in that issue is indeed entitled Aural Objects. The image you see here comes not from Rick Altman, but from Walter Murch, whose award-winning sound editing includes The Conversation, Apocalypse Now, The English Patient, and Cold Mountain. In the transom piece from which this chart comes, Murch distinguishes between encoded sounds, like language, and embodied sounds, like music, each communicating with a different hemisphere of the brain, according to Murch. Encoded sounds with the left brain, embodied sounds with the right. The artistry in sound editing, Murch advises, consists in layering of sounds and in moving at different moments along a sonic spectrum that he allies with the color spectrum. Anthropology, ethnomusicology, and acoustomology, another development in chronological time, has also been extremely influential, and most especially on my work. Acoustomology is Stephen Fell's coinage for the anthropological fieldwork he did among the Kaluli people of Papua New Guinea beginning in the 1970s and continuing in the 1990s. That's field on the top right in this slide. Dwelling in a dense rainforest that offered little in the way of distant views, the Kaluli people were exquisitely tuned to the sound world they inhabited, in particular to the sounds of running water and of birds. His soundmark book, Sound and Sentiment, Birds, Weeping, Poetics, and Song in Kaluli Expression, was published in 1982, followed by several sound recordings, including Voices of the Rainforest. And we're going to listen to an excerpt for this. What Fell did was to follow the Kaluli people in the course of a day and capture on his tape recorder at each stage both the ambient sounds of the rainforest and the songs that the people sang. From morning to night to real morning, making sago, cutting trees for the garden, and so forth. In a contribution to the Soundscape newsletter in 1994, Fell singles out for special mention the track you are about to hear, Relaxing by the Creek. Let me read you an excerpt from Fell's remarks before you listen. Evoking the flowing presence of creek paths, Ulahi's songs, like the Wolu Creek where she sang them, meander and flow through Kaluli lives and memories by linking together places and suggestions that the flow, their names tell the stories about events and feelings. Ulahi once told me that every one of her songs was like a pool on a creek. So every Kaluli song swirls, centers, circles in place, then flows on to mingle and merge with places and voices elsewhere. So I'd like for us to do a little, deep listening to this. It takes a minute or two. And I invite you to pay particular attention to the ambient sounds out of which Ulahi's songs emerge. I hate to stop. Well, it's the language of the Kaluli people, and I'm not sure what that is. But can you hear how the cadences of the song are like birds? The Kaluli people believe that birds are reincarnations of human spirits, and that the birds are speaking to them. So the next field that I want to instance here chronologically is communication and information science. So Barry Truax, who's going to be giving a special presentation in this workshop on Saturday, and if some of you are just going to be dropping in and dropping out, Saturday morning might be a good time to show up, because his work combines soundscape mapping of the sort that R. Murray Schafer initiated. Barry Truax is an emeritus professor at Simon Fraser. Combines this kind of sound mapping with information science, and this diagram comes from Barry Truax's 1984 book, Acoustic Communication. He combines information science, soundscape mapping, with acoustic, electroacoustics. So in his creative work, Barry takes, I'm calling him Barry, I mean we've communicated, but I've never actually met him, so I'm really looking forward to that on Saturday. It combines found sounds, which are then electronically processed, with electronically produced sounds to create an acoustic environment that will shift your listening into a different place in more ways than one. So Barry was kind enough to share with me this excerpt that we're going to listen to, which is some of his recent work, fairly recent work, from 2009, 10 years ago, which immerses the listener in an imaginary cavern under Glastonbury, Somerset, the legendary burial site of King Arthur. So this is a space-time journey, and the entire composition is called Chalice Well. Again, I hate to stop it, but in the interest of time, I think we should move on. Okay, I have to warn you that this is probably the densest part of what I'm going to say, so I'm going to be reading mostly, but we are going to be listening to something here, and that is mediality and intermediality and their intersections with sound studies. And we're going to begin, however, with an audio. As melodious as it may seem to us, birdsong is, for the birds at least, all about territory. They repeat the same calls to claim territory and to keep in sonic touch with their mates. In their extremely influential book, 1,000 Plateaus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, 1980, English translation 1988, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari isolate the refrain
in French, retournelle, literally a return, as the dynamic that forms territories, human and animal. Rhythms establish order amid chaos and create what Deleuze and Guattari called milieu. Each milieu is, however, unstable. Intermediality, intermediality. And I'm quoting, every milieu is vibratory. In other words, a block of space-time constituted by the repetition of the component. Every milieu is coded, a code being defined by periodic repetition. But each code is in a perpetual state of transcoding or transduction. Transcoding or transduction is the manner in which one milieu serves as the basis of another, or conversely, is established atop another milieu, dissipates in it, or is constituted in it. Rhythm is the milieu's answer to chaos. What chaos and rhythm have in common is the in-between, the intermedial. With enough repetitions, a milieu can become a territory, but the threat of exhaustion from within or invasion without is always present. So as heady as these ideas are, Deleuze and Guattari's territories and in-betweenness have proved useful in sound studies, particularly with respect to migrations of sound across media in new configurations of space and time. Intermediality is the term for these migrations. You see on the screen two examples. One, Paul Klee's drawing Twittering Machine, which Deleuze and Guattari use as the frontispiece to their chapter on the refrain, and The Noise of Time, a performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Quartet No. 15 by the theatrical troupe Complicité and the Emerson String Quartet. With respect to sound, theater, chamber music, and theater, chamber music, and drawing come from different milieux, but each of these two examples establish a new intermedial reality. I hope you can appreciate that this is kind of sound turned into movement with the Emerson String Quartet and the theater of the Complicité acting troupe in London, and that the Twittering Machine is multimedia in multiple ways, because it looks like a mobile, but it's also a drawing. Okay, moving along. This is where I came in to this field, and that is history. Alain Corbin's Village Bells, The Culture of the Senses in the 19th Century French Countryside, 1994, is the first of several books from the 1990s, my own included, that take up the stance of anthropology, ethnomusicology, acoustomology, and turn attention toward cultures that existed in the past. So Corbin's focus is on the function of village bells, not only in marking territory, but in organizing life. So this is not, of course, his audio file, but I think you can hear the effect here of the bell as a sound mark and the bell as a marking of territory, but also the bell as a potential expression of emotion and conflict. Historical sound studies is really a flourishing field. There are actually two new series of books, one from University of Pennsylvania Press and another from the University of Illinois Press. And historical sound studies, of course, is what this workshop tomorrow is doing. Okay, this is going to be quick. Alex and I were talking about this at lunch. The use of iPods, solitary listening, auditory, shutting yourself off from the rest of the world. When I'm teaching the oral culture course at USC that I teach, I love having something from Michael Bull, who is a sociologist who's been writing about this since the 1990s. So this is what, this is from his latest, which is a chapter called iPod Culture, The Toxic Pleasures of Audiotopia in the Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies. The aesthetic colonization of urban space by many iPod users is in part a technological tale whereby urban experience becomes synonymous with technological experience. iPod use seamlessly joins together disparate experience by unifying the complex, contradictory, and contingent nature of the world beyond the user. The success of these strategies depends upon the creation of an all-enveloping wall of sound through which the user looks. Users report that iPod experience is at its most satisfying when no external sound seeps into their world to distract them from their dominant and dominating vision. I love assigning Bull's work in this seminar because, you know, these students are 18 to 22 years. They hate it. They always say, it's not like that. Listening on iPods actually enhances my experience of the world. It also turns out in the last couple of years that many of them say what they're listening to is actually not music, but podcasts. And they also say, look, if I see somebody that I want to talk to, I can always take out one bud. Okay. Okay. Architectural acoustics. The English world traveler Thomas Coriat describes in 1608 the transcendental elation he experienced at hearing a musical celebration of San Roche's feast day in Venice, a vocal and instrumental performance, quote, so good, so delectable, so rare, so super excellent, that it did even ravish and stupefy all those strangers that never heard the like. But how others were affected with it, I know not. For my own part, I can say this, that I was for the time even wrapped up with St. Paul into the third heaven. Coriat's allusion is to 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4, where Paul describes coming into the presence of God. It was the stringed instruments and the singing in particular that wafted Coriat into that place. An ethereal effect seems to have been produced by 3 viol players when they took up therbos, lutes with long necks, quote, to which they sung also, who yielded admirable sweet music, but so still, so quiet that is, that they could scarce be heard but by those very near them, end quote. It's likely that the music Coriat heard was within the acoustic space of the Chiesa San Rocco, and that it was composed by Giovanni Gabrieli, who was responsible for music at San Rocco, as well as the Basilica San Marco. Gabrieli's music would have played this acoustic space as if the space itself were a musical instrument. And we can hear some music that Gabrieli wrote specifically for this space, not necessarily the occasion that Coriat heard, but music written for this space.
Well, again, I hate to move on, but here we are. With neuroscience, localization of sound processing in particular areas of the cortex dates back to the research of Pierre Bourdieu in the 1860s. But brain positron emission tomography, PET scans, and functional magnetic response imaging, fMRI, have made it possible to see with our eyes what we hear in our brains. Researchers at MIT reported in 2016 the existence of 6 basic sound patterns in the auditory cortex in response to incoming sounds. 4 of the patterns were linked to general properties of sound like frequency, but one of the patterns was linked specifically to speech recognition and another specifically to music. Other researchers have located cross-links between language and music in response to songs. It's the ubiquity of these images that I really want to call attention to today. This might seem like another objectification of sound, but I think when we see this mapping in the brain, it's also an invitation to attend to the interrelation of sensory experience in the brain, but not only sensory experience, but activity like walking and perhaps like dance. Okay, politics. We're moving into these newer phases here, and this is really going to be a segue into my summation. Schaeffer's motivation for founding the World Soundscape Project had its political side, to counteract the noisiness of modern life by attuning people to the larger world of sound that surrounds them. Noise abatement schemes were one practical outcome of the project. The political turn that has occurred more recently in sound studies is edgier. Steve Goodman's book, Sonic Warfare, Sound, Affect, and the Ecology of Fear, 2010, regards sound as a physical, intimidating force exemplified in such events as the, quote, psychoacoustic correction aimed at Panama strongman Manuel Noriega by the U.S. Army and at the Branch Davidians in Waco by the FBI. The image you see on the left accompanied an article on weaponizing sound. Could sonic devices have injured diplomats in Cuba? You all heard about this, right? This also happened, I think, in Shanghai. This event actually happened in 2017. The reportage was in 2017, which was 7 years after Goodman's book. Affect in Goodman's title is understood to be not an individual's emotional or cognitive response to sounds, but something more immediate and visceral and threatening, a full body blow. Resistance is possible, however, in the intense high frequency sounds of electronic dance music. This is according to Goodman. And Afrofuturism, which combines science fiction with electronically produced ambience with archival sampling of sounds from the African diaspora, typically blues, jazz, slave songs. Note we're going to listen to a clip here from a band in LA called Clipping, and this is from their album Splendor and Misery, which I think came out in 2016. Note the backward gesturing and forward gesturing voice of defiance that emerges from an electronically altered time-space. So like the work of Barry Truax, the electronically produced sounds are supposed to disorient you in space and in time, and Afrofuturism wants to connect the past to the future through the present. So this is a very conscious invitation for you to give up the parameters of your location and your listening with political interests.
only beautiful black. Sitting the pyramids, being Imhotep for homies. Isn't loneliness a price we're paying for a new beginning? I got a pocket full of stars. Flying up the bars. You inhibit a world where you is not a death sentence. To drop a message already and open for suggestion, whatever.
Okay, let me read over this to talk about the work of the other person you see here, Brandon LaBelle. This is from a street performance called Liquid Architecture. He is a California-born artist, sound artist, and theorist who is based in Berlin. And he has a new book called Sonic Agency, Sound and Emergent Forms of Resistance. And in that, he locates 4 sonic figures of resistance with political potential. First, the invisible. Second, the overheard. Third, the itinerant. And fourth, the weak. So the image you see on the screen on the right is from one of LaBelle's own site-specific projects, Liquid Architecture from 2015, which translates the flow of sound into silent movement. A more recent project, Stranger Recordings, 2017, exemplifies his interest in specific urban sites or acoustic territories, as he calls it. LaBelle describes Stranger Recordings thus: through a series of uncertain and hesitant walks taken in different cities, the artist attempts to carve out a form of hidden inhabitation, an acoustematic mode of occupation shaped by a listening from below, shifting between ground and sky, the articulate and the inarticulate. The artist constructs an ontological framework of poetical vibration, one tuned to the elsewhere, here. LaBelle's ontological framework gestures toward a recent and controversial turn in sound studies from aesthetic and social science framings of oral culture, which my own work has been all about, to sound as sound. Along with Goodman's sonic warfare, Greg Henge's Noise Matters Towards an Ontology of Noise, and articles by Christoph Cox on sound art stand out as sound marks in this ontological turn. Okay, let me just say a little bit here about, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, whether it's Hinge, Hinge, anyway. Noise for Hein is not the random frequencies that we would recognize as meaningless, obnoxious sounds. Rather, Henge's noise is the matrix out of which all human-created meaning emerges, and not just auditory meaning. The process happens across all media. Henge's scheme can be understood as a figure-ground relationship. Perception is a matter of where one turns one's attention, to figure or to ground. In the image on the screen, showing a visit to the Vasarely Museum in Budapest, this illustrates this vibratory matrix. Vasarely's title, Ecosia, gestures towards the eco, E-C-O, as in ecology, as well perhaps as to echo. Babbage is not someone who Henge cites, but Babbage's conception of noise in the Earth's atmosphere can help us understand this figure-ground relationship. For Babbage, meaningful sounds dissipate into white noise. For Henge, noise provides the stuff out of which auditory meanings are made. Okay, so I'm going to try, and I am wrapping up, to see what we can, many disparate fields, many strands, how can we address the possibility of synthesis? So when I first started teaching
this oral culture course at USC, I thought sound studies was like a convergence point among all these other disciplines: cultural studies, psychology, phenomenology, physics and acoustics, aesthetics, physiology, and neuroscience. I'm not so convinced that it really is a convergence. Other people have talked about this. Is sound studies a field, a coherent field? So I've isolated here some possible links across disciplines. One of them is transduction, and I'm citing here work by Deleuze and Guattari, as well as by Stefan Helmrich, who is an anthropologist who spent time in the sonic environment of a submarine. Vibration, coming from Steve Goodman, but ultimately coming from Deleuze and Guattari. Resonance, as proposed by Veit Ehrlman, Deborah Kapchan, and David Toop. And sonic anthropology, and some examples here that I'm going to talk more about are Holger Schutze and Ryan McCormick. Okay, so transduction is the transfer of energy from one medium to another. The human ear, for example, is a transducer. It converts sound waves into electrical signals. Helmreich has suggestively applied this physics term to social, cultural, and psychological phenomena in the article on transduction for the textbook Keywords in Sound. Vibration provides the energy in these transactions. Goodman regards audible sound as only one manifestation of vibration, and I'm going to read this quote from Goodman. If we subtract human perception, everything moves. Anything static is so, only at the level of perceptibility. At the molecular or quantum level, everything is in motion, is vibrating. Equally, objecthood, that which gives an entity duration in time, makes it endure, is an event irrelevant of human perception. All that is required is that an entity be felt as an object by another entity. All entities are potential media that can feel or whose vibrations can be felt by other entities. This is a realism, albeit a weird, agitated, and nervous one, end quote. So in physical terms, Goodman extends sound studies to include ultrasound and infrasound. In perceptual terms, he challenges us to listen for vibrations that we may not hear with our ears, but can feel with our bodies and imagine in our minds. As, for example, and I do want to play this audio production in a sound fiction workshop from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona in 2013. So what you get here is a recording that combines the sounds of somebody getting ready to take a shower. Then it shifts to the neurons in the shower taker's brain, and then it shifts out, or maybe combines both, when the water turns out to be too hot. Here we go. Great. Okay, I'm actually going to skip over sonic anthropology. Basically, Schultz's idea, he's a musicologist, but his idea basically is that we should be attuned to all sounds, and that rather than listening to things, we should listen through things, realizing that we are part of that sound communication process. This is very much indebted to Goodman. So in the interest of time and hearing what you think about all this, I'm going to move on to my own current conceptualization, which is something of a flowchart. It begins with the physics of sound at the objective end of the continuum, passes through cultural filters, including media, and culminates with the subjective experience of individuals at the other end. Each juncture in this flowchart is a site of transduction, indicated on the chart by a blue T. These points of transduction, from wave signal to electrical signal, from sensation to cultural filters, from cultural filters to individual experience, are, I propose, just as worthy of attention as the entities themselves. I don't know where to go with this, but that's my new idea. To think about these energy points rather than to think about each of these things individually. Okay, and finally, implications for historical sound studies. If we consider sound holistically in the way that I've been suggesting here, historical sound studies should not be embarrassed by the fact that we don't have recorded sounds from before 1860. 1860, there was a guy in France who had this thing where it was writing sounds on paper, and they've only recently been able to decode that. So Daniel Feaster gives us one tool in his capacious understanding of the word phonography as the writing of sound. That can happen in codes like alphabet and musical notation, as well as in architectural spaces, which is the subject of the seminar, of the workshop tomorrow, or this weekend. In visual arts, which is the subject of the second workshop in the series next autumn, and in brain tissue, which is the subject of the third workshop. David Toop's notion of sinister resonance invites us to encounter painting and drawing as sounded media. What you see in the image on the screen is a cut from the title page to an early 17th century comedy called Green's Tu Quoque, which uses a banderole to represent the protagonist's verbal tic, "Tu quoque, to you, sir." He says that regardless of what people say to him. This and other play titles, title pages that feature speech banderoles invite a purchaser to hear a play as at the play at hand, as well as to read it, indeed hearing it in the act of reading. So the idea of a force field, this space-time where things are interacting with each other, might become a useful model for historical sound studies if we can accept the fact that space and time are not linear, but are variable, and to face up to the fact that we occupy the same space-time as the makers of sound in the 16th and the 17th century do. So maybe Babbage, he, after all, thought about computers 100 years before they were practicable. Maybe he also anticipated quantum mechanics in his sense of the Earth's atmosphere as a unified sound field. So within this field of sound, across time, across historical time, there are certain constants, the physical properties of sound, varying media for the transmission of sound, the physiological apparatus of the human ear, that hasn't changed, the neurological wiring of the human brain, that hasn't changed. Differences in perception from one individual to another. So I'm so drawn to work like Fell's that talk about the Kaluli people.
He does talk about individuals, but I mean, it seems to me that all the evidence, I mean, certainly the evidence that we have about people who went to the theater in Shakespeare's time is that people's reactions were all over the map. So we can't really assume that we can zero in on a specific early modern subject and make that stand for everyone. Okay, variables within the sound field. Ambient soundscapes, very different across historical time. Dominant media, very different. Acoustic spaces. Cultural filters, including philosophies of sound, as well as learned habits of listening. Okay, and this is it. A 21st century investigator of sound stands within the same force field as 16th and 17th century producers and consumers of sound, at albeit however far a remove. We should not minimize that situation. Even as we investigate material and cultural differences, we should cultivate a sonic persona that is open to sound in whatever form it materially presents itself to us. That can include PET scans and spectrograms, as well as material media before reproducible sound recording. So, to answer the subtitle of my talk, I would say that sound studies, historical sound studies in particular, is in very good shape today. Thank you for your attention. This was a lot. Thank you. I don't know how much time we have for questions. So anything, everything, thank you. And any responses that you would like to share to any of those sounds that we listen to, all of that would be welcome.